Okay, hi everyone. Just going to give it a few seconds while everyone arrives and gets settled in. If you're already here, then make sure that you've got your chat and your Q&A buttons open and everything, so that you're ready if you want to ask any questions. And we'll start properly in a couple of seconds. Okay, I think we'll start now. So welcome to today's group online school session for the MyTutor online school. So Mondays are now GCSE Biology sessions, so we'll be continuing these classes weekly for the next few weeks. We're going to carry on from some of the content that we studied last week with part of the fuller timetable. So we're going to carry on from there, but don't worry if you didn't attend, because we're starting kind of a new section. So don't worry too much, you haven't missed out, and I'll do a quick run through. This session is an hour long. I'm going to spend a bit of time going through content, and there'll be regular breaks for questions and things, which we'll do through the question and answer buttons. My name's Charlotte. So I studied conservation and biodiversity at the University of Exeter. I've been tutoring for MyTutor for about 3 years now, and have tutored over 150 lessons, as well as all of the biology classes for the online school this summer. Okay, so what are we going to do today? So last week, and for the last kind of week and a half, I suppose, we've been looking at coordination and control in the body. So we looked at reflex reactions in the nervous system. We looked at the brain as in its role as the coordination center for coordinating all of our nervous impulses and the messages that go around the body. And we talked about the eye as an example of a receptor. So cells that detect a change in the environment and then pass that message on to the brain via our nervous system to say that something needs changing, so that we can react to changes in our external environment. So we've talked about all of those. And this week we're going to look at hormonal control. So another method of control within the body, of sending messages around the body. And hormonal control takes place as part of the endocrine system. So we're going to discuss that today, and then we're going to look at how the endocrine system controls blood glucose levels in the blood. And this is all an example of homeostasis. Homeostasis is how we kind of create an equilibrium in our body, so how we maintain an even level of everything. So homeostasis is the word that we use to describe how we keep our internal temperature constant, how we keep our blood glucose levels constant, how we keep our water levels constant in our bodies. And over the next few weeks, we're going to learn about all of that. But we've started with how all of that is controlled, so via the nervous system, and we're going to extend that this week by looking at how hormonal control and the endocrine system features in that. So that's the role today. And I thought we'd start off with a Slido. So if you've been in my sessions before, you might have done a Slido. They are basically a word cloud. So what I'll do is set it going now, and I will post a link in the chat. Okay, so pasting that link now. If you open that link on your browsers wherever you are, or you can use your phones and use the QR code here, that should allow you to answer the question, what keywords do you know about hormones and the endocrine system? So just pop down any keywords that you know about hormones, how they work in the body, what they're to do with, what they might control, anything that you can think of, pop them in the word cloud there, and we'll get kind of a good idea of what we all understand about hormones so far. So good. Loads of stuff coming through now. Testosterone, serotonin, the thyroid, endorphins, fluids, maintaining fluids, yeah. Those are really good. Hormones, the key word here. Lots of people putting hormone, brilliant. Dopamine, negative feedback, slow response, secretion, adrenaline, glands, pituitary gland. Yes, we're going to talk about the pituitary gland today. Long term again, complementary systems, really good, all of these. Keep going. You can put in as many keywords as you know. So do keep going. Bring them in. Digestive system, yes. Ovaries in there as well. Complementary systems. Growth, yes. Hormones are all to do with our growth. Really good. Estrogen in there as well. Dopamine, bloodstream, yeah. Really good. Okay. Any more? Prolactin. I think. Oh, yeah. Pituitary gland again. Estrogen, growth plates. Amazing. Okay, loads of good stuff in here. Oh, more coming in now. Well done. Cortisol in there as well. Norepinephrine. Yes. Well done, whoever managed to spell that one correctly. I can never do that. Fantastic. Okay, amazing. So that's a really good summary of keywords there. Lactic acid in there a couple of times. Okay. I'm going to stop that one there. Okay. Well done, everyone. That gives me a really good understanding of how much you know already. So I think there's definitely a kind of a range of people on this tutorial. So I know that we've got some students who are going into GCSE next year. We've got others who are using this as revision to take it onto A level. So quite a wide range of understandings, but loads of really good keywords there. So hopefully we'll cover most of those today or in the next couple of weeks. And you should end up with either a good understanding or a good revision of your understanding of hormones in the endocrine system. A couple of people asking about whether there's a quiz today. We are not doing a Kahoot quiz today, but we are going to do some kind of past paper questions instead. So there is going to be a little quiz at the end. Okay. So, what is the endocrine system and why do we have it? So the endocrine system, like the nervous system, coordinates and controls reactions in your body. So it is similar to the nervous system in that way, but it's made up of a different set of glands and chemicals. And it has a slightly different reaction time. So the endocrine system is made up of glands that secrete hormones, which generally have slower and more lasting effects than actions generated by the nervous system. Not always, but most of the time there is a slower reaction. So I wanted to show how they fit into our kind of reaction sequence that we've talked about before. So we talked about how a stimulus, which is a change in the internal or external environment. And that change is perceived by receptors, for example, the eye that we talked about last week. And the receptors send a message, in this case via nerves, to the control center, which can be the brain and the spinal cord, so the coordinating center, which then sends another message via a motor neuron to effectors, which are muscles or glands. And it's the effectors that respond to that change that was perceived all the way back there in the stimulus. And the effector can be a muscle or a gland. And the muscles, you know, before muscles contract, so we had the really good example of if you touch something hot, you get all of those messages that run through your body, through those neurons, and then you jerk your hand away as a reflex action. So that's an example of a muscle contracting as the effector, so that you have a response to that change. But if it's not a muscle responding, then it's a gland. We have several glands in our body, and we're going to run through them in a sec, but glands secrete chemicals called hormones. That's purely what they're there for. And those chemicals, hormones, pass into the blood. And the blood, as we know, is a really efficient way of stuff traveling around our bodies. We have blood vessels in every kind of nook and cranny of our bodies, right to the tips of our fingers and our toes. So you can get hormones almost anywhere using the blood. And the blood can therefore carry the hormone to its target organ. So hormones have a target organ that they're traveling to, where there are receptors on cell membranes that can pick up that hormone and then trigger a response. So it's a kind of slightly longer way around than a muscle which just contracts. We have those extra steps of the gland secreting the hormone into the blood, travels through the blood, which takes however long to get to the organ. It's picked up by the receptors on the cell membranes of the target organ, and only then do we get a response. So then our body responds to that change. So that's why it's a slightly slower effect than if it's purely through the nervous system to a muscle. Okay, so that's, I suppose, a summary of why we have the endocrine system and what it's made up of. In general, the endocrine system is used for kind of more lasting change within the body. So nervous system is quite a short-term solution, whereas the endocrine system is more of a longer-term change, which is why it's good to have the two systems of control. Okay, lots and lots of writing on this slide, but don't worry, it's not as intimidating as it looks. I didn't want to put it any smaller so that you couldn't see it. So where are all of these glands that form the endocrine system? What hormones do they produce and what do they do? You do need to know some of these specific examples, but there's not as many as it looks on this page, and you will learn about them in other sections as well of GCSE Biology. So it's not just that you'll learn them here and then forget about them. They'll come back again. So let's start at the top with the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland is a little gland in our brain, and it's the master gland. It's really, really important. And because it's the master gland, it secretes some hormones that then tell other glands to secrete hormones. So it's almost like the coordinating center for the endocrine system. So it does secrete some hormones that have a direct effect on the body. So two examples for that. The first is ADH, which affects the amount of urine produced in the kidney. So ADH is secreted straight from the pituitary gland, heads to the kidney, and affects the amount of urine produced there. And the same for growth hormone, which affects the growth rate in children. That comes straight from the pituitary gland and acts on the body. But the pituitary gland also secretes other hormones that cause other endocrine glands to release hormones in turn. So they send like messenger hormones, basically, so that other hormones will be released at the right place in the body. We've got 3 examples of those. So the first is a hormone called follicle stimulating hormone, which is only present in women, and it stimulates the ovaries to produce estrogen, which is the female sex hormone. So FSH is released from the pituitary gland, travels to the ovaries and says, hey, you need to release some estrogen. That's how that works. Another hormone is TSH, which stimulates the thyroid gland to make thyroxine, which controls metabolism rate. So again, the pituitary gland releases TSH, TSH goes to the thyroid gland, and the thyroid gland releases thyroxine to control our metabolism rate. So that's to do with digestion, making sure that we digest at the optimum time. And finally, the third example is luteinizing hormone, which is LH. This is present in men. So the pituitary gland would release LH in men, which would then travel to the testes and stimulate the testes to produce testosterone, which is the male sex hormone. So FSH, TSH, and LH are all kind of signaling hormones. So they travel to the next gland, which then produces the hormone that has an effect in the body. You do need to know the examples and what they do. So I appreciate quite a lot to write down. I'll make sure that we go nice and steady. And again, you will be coming back to these as well. So for example, we're going to talk about one hormone in particular for the rest of this session once we've gone through this. And then we'll cover the others as well. So don't worry if you don't remember them all now, they will come back. But from this, I'm hoping that you'll gain a kind of general understanding of where the different glands are in the body and the sort of hormones that they produce and what they're to do within the body. So you've got some good understanding of the sort of reactions and processes in the body that are controlled by hormones. Okay, good question, Ty. I think now's a good time to mention that you can use the chat and the Q&A. So the chat goes straight to myself at the moment. So any questions that you have for me, the Q&A is visible for everyone. Just having a quick scroll through the Q&A before we do the rest of this slide. Okay, one really good question saying what stimulates human growth hormone and how do growth plates close and what affects this? So that's something that I don't know that much about and that we don't cover in this section today. So what I'll do is we'll come back to that at a later date when that comes up in the syllabus. But a really good question. Is number 2 on the list because it's it's an example of a hormone that the pituitary gland releases. So you need to know that the pituitary gland does release growth hormone, which affects the growth rate in children. But you don't need to know the specifics of how it works. Okay, so let's move on to the next gland. So let's go down the body. So we've started with the pituitary gland in the brain, and then we're moving to the thyroid gland, which is in the throat, or just below the throat. The thyroid gland, as we've kind of touched on before, releases thyroxine, which controls the metabolic rate of the body. And again, that's stimulated by TSH, which is the kind of messenger hormone that goes from the pituitary gland. So thyroxine is the hormone that's released by the thyroid gland, controls the metabolic rate of the body. Okay, then we have the adrenal gland. And the adrenal gland sits just by the kidneys there. The adrenal gland is responsible for releasing adrenaline. And adrenaline is one of the quicker acting hormones in the body because it stimulates the flight or fight response. So, you know, when something quick happens or you get a shock and you release that adrenaline and suddenly you're ready to do everything. It's a very quick response. It's very instinctive. And that is adrenaline that's released from the adrenal gland. Then we have the pancreas. The pancreas releases insulin. Insulin is the hormone that controls the levels of glucose in the blood, and that's the hormone that we're going to talk about in more detail today. So we are going to go into how that works, how insulin controls the levels of glucose in the blood. I'm going to move this up slightly so that you can see these. So then we move to the ovaries in women. So the ovaries secrete estrogen or estrogen, which controls the development of female secondary sex characteristics, which is a rather long way of saying female development and puberty. Estrogen is also involved in the menstrual cycle. We are going to go into how that works as well in a couple of sessions' time. And finally, in men, we have the testes. And the testes release testosterone, which is the male sex hormone. So that controls development of male secondary sexual characteristics, which is male features in puberty, or that develop in puberty, and is also involved in sperm production. Okay. So I appreciate we started with lots and lots of information about the pituitary gland and how it works, but the other 5 glands are relatively simple examples that you've kind of come across in other parts of the syllabus as well, and that we're going to go into in more detail. So for now, you just need to know the hormone and roughly what it does. Okay, so LH, I appreciate a couple of you are saying that's been cut off. So all that says at the bottom there, so luteinizing hormone is LH, and it stimulates the testes to produce testosterone, which is the male sex hormone. So it's kind of the same text as for FSH there. So all that you're missing off the bottom there is male sex hormone. I'm sorry that's cut off, that's typical. Okay, I have a quick pause while people are still writing and making notes, and I'll answer any more questions. I've got the first saying how many people are here today. There's about 20 of us, so a good number. It's kind of varied over the last few weeks as well while schools weren't back. So we've definitely still got probably a good 2/3 at least of the class that we had before, possibly more. So welcome back, everyone who was here before, and if you're new, welcome in general. Okay, any questions that you have, pop them in the Q&A. I'll have a quick run through that again in a second. If you want me to move the slide about a bit, then do say. I think probably managed to get most of it, but do let me know, because there's a lot of writing on there. Okay, I will change the chat. That's another suggestion so that you can send messages to all panelists and attendees. So anything that you put in the chat now, we can have kind of a discussion on there if needed. Another question there, did you make any changes from the poll that people requested or not yet? So I think those are in place. Certainly the timing of today's session, 2 till 3 o'clock, that was in response to the poll that was sent round for what times would suit people most. So hopefully, and it looks like, because there's plenty of us here today, that that's working well. Fab, let's move on to the next part. Okay, so we've called this slide a homeostasis case study. So we're going to look at a part of homeostasis, which is how blood glucose levels are controlled using the hormone insulin, which is released from the pancreas. So we've just talked about the glands and what hormones they release, but we're going to look in detail at how insulin works in the body. So, when we digest a meal, lots of glucose passes into our blood. And that's all through the digestion process. Different parts of the meals that we eat are broken down at different parts in our digestive system. We did do a session on that quite a few weeks ago now. So that will be on YouTube if you want to catch up on that. So what kind of components are broken down when in the digestive system. But the end result being that lots of glucose passes straight into the bloodstream. So glucose is soluble, it dissolves in the blood, so it can pass straight into the bloodstream from the digestive system. We need glucose for respiration, so our cells all need glucose in order to generate energy so that we can live and react and do all of the things that we do. But we need to control it, because without control, we'd have lots and lots of glucose after a meal, our cells would use a bit, the rest of it would be excreted in urine from the kidney, and then we wouldn't have any. So we need a mechanism of controlling the levels in the blood and storing some when we have excess. The end result being that our cells would not be able to respire to create energy. So we need to control those glucose levels. A couple of diagrams on here, and a 6-step process for what happens when we have glucose in our bloodstream. So the first thing to mention is the pancreas. So the pancreas is that organ that we talked about. It's kind of, well, it's sort of around the digestive system area, really, behind the liver. And the pancreas monitors and controls blood glucose concentration. So it senses the amount of glucose in the blood. After a meal, blood glucose rises and the pancreas goes, oh, lots of glucose, need to store that. So it produces insulin. Insulin is a hormone, a chemical, so the pancreas releases that into the blood. And insulin allows glucose to move into body cells to be used in respiration. That's my fault there, that's glucose, not insulin. So it should be glucose instead there. Can't see that very well. Let's put move it above. There we go. Okay, so blood glucose rises after a meal. Pancreas produces insulin in response to that, and the insulin allows body cells to receive glucose. Body cells want to use glucose for respiration. So let's say muscle cells want to use glucose for respiration because we need to contract those muscles and we need energy to do that. That insulin, as well as allowing the body cell to just absorb that glucose in the first place, it also triggers the mechanism of storing that glucose as glycogen. Glycogen, we've talked about briefly before, is an insoluble form of lots of glucose molecules all joined together. So it's basically so big once they're all joined together that it can't dissolve in water. So it's stored in the cells. It's a really good way of storing glucose. So muscle and liver cells in particular store glycogen so that they've got kind of a ready-made, almost like a fridge that they can go to and get more glucose when they need it later. When those glycogen stores are full, any excess glucose is converted to lipids. So glucose can be used in respiration, can be stored as glycogen, and the final resort is to convert it into lipids, which are fats. If you regularly consume lots of sugary food, that means you have lots and lots of glucose in your body, then by the time the body's used what it needs for respiration and has stored as much as it can as glycogen, it's storing quite a bit as fat. And that's where you see weight being put on, and therefore the risk of obesity increasing. So that's why we're all advised not to eat too many sugary foods, because you put on weight when your body gets to where it has to store the glucose as fat rather than anything else. And so you put on that weight and run the risk of obesity. So looking at this graph, you can see the level of glucose in the bloodstream rises. The pancreas detects that the glucose is above the normal level and releases insulin, which means that glucose is removed from the blood. It's taken out of the blood. It's either used for respiration, stored as glycogen, or stored as lipids. And again, you've got kind of a schematic on this side. So the pancreas releases insulin, glucose is taken in by cells, converted to glycogen, blood glucose falls, and the normal level of blood glucose is resumed. So we're looking at that kind of endless cycle. This is part one of the control system. So what happens when blood glucose is low? Then we use a hormone called glucagon, which kind of completes that picture. So if we look at the graph that we started on the last slide, you can see after a meal, we've got lots and lots of glucose in the bloodstream. Abnormally high levels of glucose are detected by the pancreas, insulin's released, all that glucose, or as much as possible, is taken out of the bloodstream. But then hold on, now we've gone too low, below that optimum level of glucose in the bloodstream. And in response to those low levels of glucose, glucagon is secreted. So this is a second hormone. It's less well known than insulin because, well, I suppose because it's kind of the secondary reaction to insulin. But it's the second part of this process of keeping the level of glucose in equilibrium in our bodies, so keeping homeostasis. Glucagon is secreted. So when blood glucose falls below the ideal level, the pancreas secretes glucagon, which is another hormone. Glucagon makes the liver break down the glycogen stores back to glucose. So all of those long rows of glucose that were stored as glycogen can then be broken down again into individual glucose molecules, released back to the blood and taken to cells for respiration. And using those two hormones creates a kind of constant blood glucose level. So it's constantly fluctuating, but you're always aiming to get back to that level, that optimum level. And it's an example of negative feedback. So a change happens, which triggers a response, which takes it back to the normal level. We're going to talk more about negative feedback next week. But it's a really good example of that. And you can see the full diagram here, which sort of puts it in perspective. So the pancreas responds to whether the blood glucose is too high or too low. It secretes insulin or glucagon, which either means that glucose is taken up by the cells and stored if blood glucose is too high, or if blood glucose is low, then it says, hold on, get some more out there, and the liver breaks down its glycogen stores and sends those into the blood. Amino acids and fats are also broken down. So if you have had any glucose that's been stored as fats as that last resort, that will be broken down then as well. And both of those contribute to that normal level of blood glucose being resumed. So what you're trying to make sure throughout this whole thing is that muscles always have a supply of glucose that they can use for respiration, so we can continue to function as we need to survive. Okay, any questions about those? I have seen Thanks, Pranav. There's a question about diabetes. We are moving on to that for the next couple of slides. So, okay. No questions? All sorted on insulin and glucagon. Okay, let's talk about diabetes then. Oh, forgot about this diagram. This is a really good summary diagram. So obviously this will be available on YouTube later, but print screen now if you want this immediately in your notes. So this diagram is really handy for kind of remembering how glucagon and insulin are used. It shows blood glucose level as kind of a tank with lots of taps on it, which I think is a really good way of remembering how they work. So you've got lots and lots of glucose coming from food, and you can also have glucose from amino acids or fat or from glycogen stored in the liver. Both of the release of those are controlled by glucagon. So if we need to get glucose into the blood, we can release those reserves that are controlled by glucagon. If you need to get it out, you can turn on the insulin taps, which remove glucose by storing it as glycogen or using it for respiration or converting to fat for storage. Okay, quick slide about diabetes. So diabetes is directly linked to insulin, and there's two types of diabetes. And so I've done kind of parallel lists here to try and make the difference between them really clear. There's also this diagram here. So in short, type 1 diabetes is when your body doesn't produce insulin at all. So you don't have that means to control glucose being taken out of the blood. Type 2 diabetes is when the cells don't respond to insulin. So they're missing those receptor cells that pick up the fact that insulin is there and therefore start to remove glucose from the blood. So it's a very slight difference. So type 1 diabetes, which is where we don't produce insulin at all, results in blood glucose getting very high after eating. And because it's not being taken up by the cells, because there's no insulin to tell the cells to do that, eventually the kidneys end up excreting all of that excess glucose in urine. This means that a lot of urine is produced because there's a lot of glucose to excrete. The person feels thirsty because you're dehydrated, and tired as well because you haven't got the glucose entering the cells for respiration. So you feel tired and thirsty. Instead, the body breaks down those fat and protein stores of glucose that they've put by, so you lose a lot of weight as well if you're becoming a type 1 diabetic. Type 1 diabetes starts in young children and teenagers, and it may be influenced by genetics, but we're not sure. So if one of your parents are type 1 diabetic, then there may be more chance that their child would be. But the link between there isn't, no one's quite sure how it works yet. By contrast, type 2 diabetes is when the pancreas still makes insulin, but less than the body needs, and the body doesn't recognize it properly. So the cells stop responding properly to the little bit of insulin that is produced. And this tends to start as people get older. So whereas type 1 diabetes is normally when you're a child, type 2 diabetes starts as people get older. Type 2 diabetes is strongly linked to obesity and lack of exercise, and also has a strong genetic link, as does obesity. So all three of those are kind of linked together. In countries such as the UK and the USA, type 2 diabetes is increasingly common because obesity is becoming more common. So there's a kind of direct correlation between the two there. Okay. So several kind of differences there. You can see how they're linked to the hormone insulin and blood glucose control. Okay. Any questions? What happens if one parent is type 1 genetic and type 2 genetic, and the other parent is type 2 diabetic? Okay, so in that case, it very much depends on, I see type 1 diabetic. Okay, so if you had one parent that was type 1 diabetic and the other is type 2 diabetic, it's complicated because it's not just one gene that's involved in diabetes and in obesity. There are several different genes that all combine together to produce those responses in the body, which means because you get one allele for each gene from each parent, and they have got those alleles from their parents, so there are lots and lots and lots of different possibilities for the genetic makeup that you could have. If both parents had diabetes, it would be likely that the child would have diabetes at some point, type 1 or type 2, but there's no guarantee. It doesn't mean that you necessarily would. There's also a possibility that they wouldn't, depending on purely the genes that are passed on. So there's a kind of short and slightly complicated answer. So the answer is that you would be quite likely, but it doesn't mean that you would. It doesn't mean that the child must be diabetic. Sometimes people with type 2 diabetes have to have limbs amputated. Why is this? Okay, so I think that this is because the body is struggling to respire, some actions become more and more impossible to do. And so muscle cells start to degrade because they're not being used. And that generally starts at the extremities first. That's my understanding, but I'm not 100% sure of exactly the mechanism. So definitely something to look up. But I think it's all through that not being able to get glucose, not being able to maintain those muscle cells and respire as needed. Okay. Any more questions? So for the last 15 minutes or so, we're going to go through some past paper questions. So not a Kahoot quiz, I'm afraid, for those of you who are fans. We'll do one of those next time, but we're going to do some past paper techniques because we need to practice what we're learning in the content here as well. Can diabetes kill? That's a good question. Yes, but it's more the consequences of diabetes. So, for example, particularly with type 1 diabetes, we're going to talk a little bit more about this next week. So we're going to talk about how to treat them. But for type 1 diabetes, the key treatment is to inject insulin into your body to replace that you're not producing. And if you can't do that, then your body more and more can't respire, and the end result would be death. Type 2 diabetes, the other thing with type diabetes is you often need to eat kind of small loads of sugar throughout the day to kind of keep the blood glucose levels dropped up. So for type 2 diabetes, the answer is usually more exercise and smaller portions at meals. That tends to be the way of controlling it. So type 2 diabetes can be fatal in extreme cases, but like I say, it's more the consequences of it, so what it does to your body, than the diabetes itself. Do you go taller in your sleep only? That's an interesting question. You do most of your growing in your sleep, but not all of it. Because when we're at rest, that's when our body has more opportunity to repair using respiration, so to make more cells. Can hypothyroidism kill? From my understanding, it can, but again, it's from the consequences of it. And hypothyroidism, as far as I know, is fairly easily controlled through medicine. A bit like diabetes. Diabetes we can mostly control now. Okay. let's move on to our first past paper question. Okay, so most of the questions that I could find about blood glucose concentration and about hormones are fairly simple, kind of knowledge-based ones. We've got one longer question that we're going to run through towards the end. So I have picked questions generally that had graphs or have figures, because I think it's a really important skill to be able to read these and to interpret them properly for those questions. So when you sit in an exam and you have exam questions in front of you, it's important to read them properly. And the thing that I normally suggest for this is underlining the keywords. And it sounds silly because you've read it and you tend to think that you understand, but when you're in an exam in a rush, it's really difficult and really easy to miss important words. And I do it quite often while I'm teaching in these sessions, so I'm a really good example of why you should always underline the keywords. So it's really easy, for example, to read, why is this more than rather than less than, and then you throw away 1 or 2 marks that you could easily have kept. So we're going to underline the keywords. So blood glucose concentration, that's our subject, in humans must be kept between 4.4 and 6.1 micromoles per deciliter cubed. 4 students, A, B, C, and D, tested their blood glucose concentration with glucose testing strips. Glucose testing strips. The diagram shows the results of the tests and the key from the test strip bottle. Okay, so we've got A, B, C, and D, and then we've got a key. So concentration of glucose in millimoles per decimeter cubed. So we've got 7 at the top here, and bearing in mind the blood glucose needs to be between 4.4 and 6.1. So really, you want to be here. This is the good one that you want in your blood glucose. Then we've got a couple of levels either side. When looking at the diagram, we can see that B has a really high blood glucose concentration and D has a really low. And the other two kind of fall in between. Okay, which student, A, B, C, or D, has diabetes and has eaten a large piece of cake? Diabetes and has eaten a large piece of cake. A, B, C, or D. Pop your answers in the chat. See what we think. So have a good look at the key there. Bear in mind the student has diabetes and has eaten a large piece of cake. So what does that mean for their blood glucose concentration? Okay, someone asking about the units there, Pranav. Sorry, this has, oh, well, you can see them there, mmol, millimole. That's the one. Okay, a few different answers there. Olivia and Type, well done. Had that one right. Tejala as well. Good, yeah, really well done. So everyone that put B, well done. Quite a few people saying B as well, so they would have really low. So the answer is B. I'll triple check, but the answer is B. Yeah. So if the student has diabetes and has eaten a large piece of cake, so they've eaten a large piece of cake, cake's really sugary, so lots of glucose goes into the blood through the digestive system there. If they've got diabetes, they have no way of extracting that glucose, because insulin depends on which type of diabetes that they have, but either way the body cells aren't taking insulin in, so they would have a really high blood glucose concentration. High in the key is 7, black area, so it's student B. Okay, lots of comments on this question, so let's talk them through. So you could say that it is D because he could be really hungry. But if he's eaten a large piece of cake, so insulin is generally a very quick response, or fairly quick. So you would say that there would be a fairly quick release of glucose into the blood and none taken up. Glucose could be derived from the stools, but remember, if they've got diabetes, they can only convert the fat. And particularly, unless it's undiagnosed, that would be unlikely to be happening because they can't access the glycogen without the insulin in order to store it. So you have only got fat stores there. Exactly. So glucose levels can't change on one piece of cake. Well, they can, because that's why, you know, even when you eat a small amount of chocolate, you feel that rush, that sugary rush, because sugar, sweet things are a source of very quick acting glucose. So they're like a sugar shot, aren't they? Pieces of chocolate, pieces of cake. So they're very fast acting. Okay. So the student has diabetes, and we already know that he's got diabetes and has eaten a large piece of cake. Okay, well done, everyone. Good comments on those. It's good to think through these things because you're all clearly following the lines of what happens when you eat something, glucose goes into the blood, you don't have insulin to be produced. So it's always good to question. Okay, a couple of quick fire questions in this one. So, which student, A, B, C, or D, is in most need of eating carbohydrates? A, B, C, or D, which one is in most need of eating carbohydrates? Do you want me to switch back quickly so you can have a look? Which one most needs to eat some carbohydrates? A, B, C, or D? Answers in chat. Good. Those of you so far that have put D, that's correct. They've got the lowest blood glucose concentration. They need to eat some carbohydrates because it's getting dangerously low. Which student, A, B, C, or D, has a healthy blood glucose concentration? Again, I'll switch back. Remember, they did say in the question what a healthy blood glucose concentration was. There we go. It's at the top there. So which one has a healthy blood glucose concentration? It's actually not that easy to see on. I need to have these in colour, really. Okay, good. Well done. So Olivia types Sejal, Santati, Pranav. Perfect. It is indeed C. Well done, everyone. Finally, there's a couple there. Name the hormone that people with diabetes inject to prevent their blood glucose concentration from becoming too high. So what hormone do you need to inject to prevent blood glucose concentration becoming high? Okay, well done everyone, that's fab. Olivia, Pranav, Tybe, Sejal, Summer, all correct. Anyone else want to have a go? Okay, good. It is insulin for that one. Well done. And then finally, oh, you can barely see this one. That's rubbish. I'll read it out. Which organ reduces or monitors, sorry, which organ monitors blood glucose concentration? Circle the correct answer. Brain, liver, or pancreas? Which one monitors blood glucose concentration? Great. Well done, everyone. It is indeed the pancreas. Fab. Okay. This question is about hormones. Hormones carry messages. What type of messenger is a hormone? Draw a ring around the correct answer. Answers in chat. Yes. Well done. Type, Sejal, Bailey, Summer, Santati, Olivia as well. Yeah, chemical is correct. And which part of the brain secretes hormones? Remember this? This was the master part on the second slide today. Draw a ring around the correct answer. Cerebellum, medulla, or pituitary gland? Okay, well done, Zyma as well. Bailey, Tobes, yeah, brilliant. Is the pituitary gland. Okay, and finally, I wanted to run quickly through a 4-mark question about how you tackle those. So this is about homeostasis. So homeostasis controls the internal conditions of the body. Explain, note the command word there, explain, how blood glucose levels are controlled in the body of someone who does not have diabetes. 4 marks for this. It's a slightly longer question, so you need to make 4 points. That's generally what I suggest. So 1 point per mark. Make sure that you read the question carefully. So what I've done for this one is I have pulled up the mark scheme because I think it's not often that you guys get to look at mark schemes, and I think it's really useful for you to see what examiners are looking for. So they've listed 4 marks here, and to get those 4 points, you need to mention all of them. Yeah, exactly. So Pranav, you've summarized it there. You would write in full sentences. That's also a question that I often get asked. Even if you bullet point, which is a really good way to order your thoughts, still write those bullet points in short but full sentences. So, if glucose is too high, insulin is released from the pancreas. So glucose moves into the cells. So you need to make sure that you're explaining, remember that command word, so take it to the next level. So blood glucose is too high, insulin is released from the pancreas, and glucose is moved into cells or stored. They'll allow you to have the glucose is stored because that happens as well. If blood glucose concentration is too low, then glucagon is released. Those words that are underlined are keywords. You need to have those in there. So glucagon is released from the pancreas, which causes glycogen to be converted to glucose and released into the blood for that 4th mark. Perfect. Nice one, Toad. That's a really nice answer there. Do we have to have and? No. But that underlining of and means that you need to make that point that the glycogen is converted to glucose and then released into the blood, because only after it's released into the blood does it affect the blood glucose levels. So that underlining there is to make the point that the student needs to make that connection, that it needs to be, glycogen needs to be converted to glucose, and the glucose goes into the blood. Okay, so you can see they're quite general here, and those are 4 points that you would definitely have made even if you were just kind of scrambling about in a real rush. But there's a couple of things that they're insisting on. They're insisting that you mention insulin and glucagon, and they're insisting that you explain fully what happens as a result of those hormones with respect to blood glucose concentration. Okay, that's all that we've got time for today. Oh, Sammy, yes, you did have a question. So, oh, thank you. Sorry, that's my neighbour. When children have a sugary snack or a drink, they get a sort of sugar high and get hyper. But as we grow up, we don't seem to get as hyper. Is this because our body becomes more stable, and why is this? That's a really good question. I think it's because as we grow up, we are we're doing more things. Our body is more used to controlling those levels. We have more cells because we're fully grown, and we have more processes happening in a rhythm. So I think it's just that our body gets better at controlling those levels. That's not a very technical explanation, but that is in general how that works. Is hypothyroidism a lifetime? That's another really good question. I think it is. I think it can develop at any time. I don't know an awful lot about hypothyroidism. I think it can develop at any time. And then I think it does have to be controlled. I'm not sure whether you can cure it. Again, something to Google. Okay, thanks everyone for today. And see you next Monday. So we're on 1 session a week now. Have a lovely week. There'll be other sessions for other subjects on other days, so make sure you keep an eye on the timetable. Again, if you're looking at small group sessions or individual tutoring, then have a look through the tutor profiles on MyTutor. Feel free to send me a message if you want to as well on there. And otherwise, I will see you next Monday. Thanks very much, everyone.